If we're going to have a vast number of federal holidays that are named after individuals, or they're named after particular events or particular causes, then Christopher Columbus is more deserving than almost anyone else of having a holiday named after him. On universal grounds, I think there are, in fact, 3 reasons why we should all be prepared to honor Christopher Columbus. And these are 3 competing universal grounds. So really, any individual can only have one of them, maybe at most 2, but probably not all 3 of these grounds for finding Christopher Columbus to be worthy of honor. The Columbus Day holiday has been a source of considerable controversy in recent years, with American progressives claiming that we shouldn't have a holiday honoring Christopher Columbus at all. They say that it's a bad thing, in fact, that Columbus brought European civilization and Christianity to the New World, and they look with great horror at the physical consequences and the biological consequences that were suffered by the original inhabitants of the Americas as a result of Columbus's arrival. They look, for example, at the diseases that came with Columbus and the tremendous depopulation that occurred among the indigenous populations as a result of their exposure to those diseases. But it goes beyond that. Really, the left has a criticism fundamentally of the ideas and the civilization and indeed the religion that Columbus brought to the New World. They simply do not like the expansion of European civilization. They do not like the expansion of Christianity. And they think it is the source of so much of what continues to be, in their minds, a colonialist project that in fact they see as being the source of almost all evil in the world today, not just in the Americas, but throughout Europe, throughout history. They see the influence of Western civilization, the influence of Christianity, as a source of great evil. This, of course, is the opposite of the traditional view. Traditionally, Americans in general, Europeans, have taken a very favorable view of European civilization, Western civilization, Christianity, and indeed Christopher Columbus. The fact that Christopher Columbus was able to expand the sphere of Christianity to the New World was a thing to be celebrated. Similarly, the fact that he was bringing European civilization and European technology and European development to a new part of the world was something that Europeans were very proud of, something that the Spanish were very proud of because they sponsored Christopher Columbus's explorations. It was something that Italians were very proud of as well because Christopher Columbus was thought to be ethnically Italian. Now, Columbus's early life is actually rather obscure, and there are some competing theories about where the Columbus family originated from. But in general, he's thought to have been Genoese. He's thought to have come from Genoa in Italy. And so the Italians take great pride in him. And of course, Italian Americans also take great pride in Christopher Columbus, and they were instrumental in lobbying for the creation of a United States federal holiday honoring Columbus. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. Find us on the web at www.modernagejournal.com. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Follow us at ModAgeJournal, and be sure to follow us on Instagram. Hit the like button here on YouTube and on every other platform that you find us. Be sure to like us. Be sure to promote us. Tell your friends about it. Modern Age is a publication for thoughtful conservatives and those who want to look deeper behind today's headlines and want to look at the philosophical and civilizational currents behind the day's events. Now, I should pause to talk a little bit about federal holidays in general because they have become a source of considerable sort of culture war friction within our country. And I should notice that, in fact, our federal holiday system, our way of picking individuals to name holidays after and picking events to name holidays after, is actually rather unusual. If you look at the United Kingdom or if you look at Canada, you'll see that there are generally far fewer public holidays and very few indeed that are named after individuals or even in many cases particular causes. In the UK, for example, there really aren't any holidays similar to Memorial Day or to Veterans Day that are public holidays. There is indeed Remembrance Day in the UK, and it's a very solemn day. It's taken very seriously, but it's not a day when government closes down. It's not a day when schools are closed. In fact, during Remembrance Day in the UK, it's actually something that helps to add to the solemnity of the day, that you have people going to work or going to school wearing, for example, memorial poppies, on their clothing, a pin of a poppy, for example, on a shirt. And this helps to, indicate that they are remembering the fallen in World War I. It's a day of great solemnity, in something of a contrast to our own Memorial Day, which, while it is a day that many Americans honor our fallen soldiers, is also a day, of course, when many Americans are simply thinking about grilling, making hot dogs and hamburgers, on a hot summer day, and marking the beginning of the summer season. Britain in general doesn't have holidays that are named after individuals. So there's no Churchill Day, there's no Victoria Day in the UK, there's no day named after great generals or great monarchs of British history. Now, in Canada, there are days that are more specifically devoted to honoring particular causes, particular incidents, or even, in one case, a particular individual. So Canada does have a Victoria Day, which honors Queen Victoria as basically the founder of the Canadian Confederation, the founder of modern Canada. Similarly, there are days in Canada. Remembrance Day is a federal holiday or is a public holiday in Canada, and there's a Labor Day in Canada as well. But the American approach of having a huge number of federal holidays that are named after particular individuals and that are named after particular causes or incidents in American life, this is rather unusual. It is, however, something that has been traditional with us going back all the way to the early years of the Republic. So if you look back at the early 19th century and indeed the last years of the 18th century, at the very beginning of our Republic, there were contesting holidays that the Republicans, that is the party of Thomas Jefferson, and the Federalists, the party of Hamilton and Adams, wanted to champion. So the Federalists believed that we should celebrate Washington's birthday as the most important day in American history because George Washington was the father of our country. And of course, not so coincidentally, George Washington was also the father of the Federalist Party, more or less. Now, the Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's party, they preferred to celebrate the 4th of July. They celebrated Independence Day because Independence Day, of course, was the nation's birthday, not just the first president's birthday, but in fact the birthday of the nation itself, because the Declaration of Independence marked our statement of independence from the United Kingdom, from the British Empire. So the 4th of July was the preferred holiday for the Republicans, and it helped, of course, a great deal that Thomas Jefferson had written the draft of the Declaration of Independence. So you could see that you had, two parties contending to have a national holiday or a holiday that would be widely celebrated based on what was beneficial for themselves. Now, of course, the Federalists did recognize that the 4th of July wasn't just a holiday that could be celebrated by Jeffersonian Republicans. The 4th of July really was an important day in the history of America as a nation, and therefore even the Federalists did allow that, yes, okay, maybe we should celebrate the 4th of July. And similarly, the Republicans, the Jeffersonians, over time became somewhat more conciliatory and started to view Washington's birthday as less of a partisan celebration of federalism and rather a celebration of America as a whole. So right from the beginning, America was thinking about federal holidays and, holidays that the entire nation would celebrate in terms of great events and great individuals. And George Washington and the Declaration of Independence, American independence itself, those were obviously the foundational primary, individuals and events that would be important in constituting the nation, and therefore they were the things that it seemed appropriate to have holidays for. We also, of course, had more traditional holidays. We had things like Thanksgiving. We had, the New Year's and Christmas holidays. These things go back very far as well. But over time, over the course of more than 200 years, now almost 250 years, America has accumulated a great many holidays, federal holidays, national holidays, that are named after particular individuals or they're named after lesser events in American history. And there's become an enormous amount of political ferment, an enormous amount of political conflict over these holidays, which again is not entirely new in our history. If you think back to the original debates and conflicts between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, we see some of the similar kinds of partisan and even cultural conflicts that are paralleled in the debates today over a holiday like Christopher Columbus's. I should mention, by the way, that back in the early days of the Republic, when it was Jeffersonians versus Federalists, There was an ideological dimension, not just a purely partisan dimension, to these contending holidays. So the Jeffersonians, the Republicans as they were then called, thought that it was a basically monarchical kind of thing to honor George Washington personally and to make Washington's birthday a national holiday, or a holiday that the country as a whole should be expected to celebrate, whether or not it was a federal holiday. The Jeffersonians, the Republicans, thought that this was an indication of the basically monarchist orientation of their enemies, the Federalists. And so during the early Republic, there was always this accusation flying between the Republicans and the Federalists, where the Republicans would claim that the Federalists were actually crypto-monarchists who really perhaps regretted American independence and wanted to perhaps ultimately reunite with Britain, or at least find an American king. And the Federalists, on the other hand, said that the Republicans, they were not just celebrating the American Revolution, they wanted to celebrate all revolutions. They wanted to honor the French Revolution, and if the Jeffersonian Republicans had gotten their way, they would have, plunged America into some sort of Jacobin bloodbath. They would have disestablished religion everywhere, and not only disestablished religion, but they would have attacked religion, they would have attacked private property. Basically, each side was accusing the other of extremism. The Federalists accused the Jeffersonians of being sort of atheistic, Republican, revolutionary, left-wing extremists, and the Jeffersonian Republicans accused the Federalists of being basically right-wing. They didn't use the phrase pro-dictator at the time, but they certainly said that the Federalists were in favor of monarchy. They were in favor of precisely the kind of government that the American Revolution was fought to overturn in America. So these kinds of political ideological battles are very familiar when it comes to what sorts of national holidays we're going to have. And it's not surprising that Christopher Columbus Day now has these kinds of left-right battles around it as well. Now, that said, it seems to me there is still an overwhelming case, which transcends left and right, for honoring Christopher Columbus and having Columbus Day. If we're going to have this panoply of federal holidays in the first place, if we're going to have a vast number of federal holidays that are named after individuals, or they're named after particular events or particular causes, then Christopher Columbus is more deserving than almost anyone else of having a holiday named after him. I think perhaps only George Washington would be a more worthy individual of having a particular holiday named after him, a federal holiday in the United States. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, most Americans have a tremendous debt of gratitude to Christopher Columbus for discovering the New World for Europe. It's because of Christopher Columbus that most of us are here in the first place. And it's because of Christopher Columbus that we enjoy the kind of life that we have, which would not be possible if our ancestors were not able to leave the old world or to leave other places. So I should mention, this is not just an argument that applies to European Americans. It's not just an argument that applies to American Christians. It's an argument that certainly applies to anyone who has come to America or whose ancestors came to America voluntarily. So it's true, I think, of Americans who are coming from Asia, Americans who might be coming from South Asia, India, Americans who might be coming from East Asia, Americans who can trace their ancestry to these places, have a tremendous debt of gratitude, a debt of a moral obligation, really, that they owe to the memory of Christopher Columbus, because Columbus, by discovering the New World and by bringing European civilization to the New World, has made possible the very things that have attracted immigrants from every part of the globe to the New World and to the United States in particular. And of course, Columbus is a figure who discovers not the continental United States. He discovers, basically what is now Haiti. He discovers a few other places, in the Caribbean. But it's thanks to Christopher Columbus's discoveries that the United States of America ultimately becomes possible. And so everyone who is grateful to be an American, everyone who feels a great, sort of patriotic debt to the United States, should also feel a debt to Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, he may have been an Italian, he may have been working, for the Crown of Castile in Spain, but he's ultimately an ancestor of the United States as well. I should mention, by the way, that one of the common canards, one of the common criticisms that's made against Christopher Columbus is completely off base. You'll see these claims that, well, Christopher Columbus was a fool because he thought he was heading to Japan, he thought he was heading to Asia, he had no idea that he was discovering a new world, he had no idea that he was discovering the Americas. First of all, that's not entirely clear. From Christopher Columbus's own writings, it certainly seems as if he, continued to believe that he had discovered, a part of Asia, that he had discovered perhaps islands off of Japan. But it's not entirely certain that that's the case. And keep in mind, Christopher Columbus was paid to find a route to East Asia, to find a route basically to Japan and to the Spice Islands of the East. This was what the Crown of Castile had hired him to do. That's why they sponsored his trip across the ocean. So Columbus had actually a financial incentive to say that this is what he discovered and that he had not discovered something completely new. Nevertheless, the actual facts of the case are somewhat blurry, and between the fact that Columbus had an incentive to claim that he had indeed found this route to Asia, and the fact that some of his own remarks are a little bit ambiguous, one might very well, hold it as an open question that Columbus may have known that he discovered something entirely new. Whether or not he did conceive of himself as discovering entirely new territories, he certainly knew that he had discovered something completely unexampled in modern European civilization in terms of finding a path to new lands, finding a path to heathen lands where Christianity had never before been introduced, and finding lands that would, yield, a number of resources, a number of goods, whether it's new agricultural discoveries, new plants, or whether it's gold and other precious metals, but that would yield new resources for his patrons and for Europe as a whole. Now, of course, this is one of the things for which he is criticized very strongly by a number of historians, especially those of a more progressive mindset. They say that, well, this is just Europe plundering the New World and plundering what they have discovered. But of course, Christopher Columbus also brings a great deal, ultimately, of development to the New World. And it's unfortunate because the crown that sponsors Christopher Columbus's explorations in the New World, which is the Crown of Castile, which at the time is, Queen Isabella is married to King Ferdinand of Aragon, and so you have a personal union creating a more or less united Spain, even though Castile and Aragon are separate kingdoms, because their monarchs are married to one another. You do in fact have a Spain that we can talk of as being a whole of a sort. Well, Spain is generally not very successful as a source of colonial development. It certainly sends over colonial officials. It sends over ultimately conquistadors who fight the Aztecs and others. You have a degree of development of the New World, economic development, under the Spanish. But of course, you have much more economic development under other Europeans who come over later, under the French, for example, under the Dutch, and of course, ultimately, and above all, under the English. So while Christopher Columbus can't take credit for what the English ultimately do, he can take credit for making all of this possible. And of course, this leads to an enormous amount of prosperity in the Americas, both in South America and in North America. And this prosperity actually leads to a far higher population in both North America and South America overall, just a human population, without getting into the specifics of ethnicity. But you have much more a flourishing of humanity as a whole in North America and South America as a result of the introduction of Western civilization than you had before this. You had a much lower population overall in the New World before Christopher Columbus came. And so simply as a matter of celebrating the growth of humanity, not just the growth of Western civilization, there is certainly much to be said in favor of Christopher Columbus. Now, particular groups have all the more reason to be grateful to Christopher Columbus. I've already mentioned that this is the case certainly for European Americans who are Americans in the first place because their ancestors came over to a land that Christopher Columbus, a world really, a hemisphere that Christopher Columbus had discovered. I've mentioned also that non-European Americans, whether they are citizens of the United States or whether they are immigrants who've come to South America or to Canada or to other places, they too, or their ancestors, have been able to come to and flourish in a new world, to flourish in the Americas as a result of the discoveries of Christopher Columbus. So they too, even though they're not, ancestrally Western civilization themselves, even people from non-Western civilizations have a great deal to celebrate about Columbus's discoveries because it has opened the New World to them as well as to Europeans. Now, there are of course people who came to the New World involuntarily, and a more ambiguous category concerns black Americans in the United States, and of course, black South Americans as well. Africans who've been brought over, whose ancestors were brought over as slaves, and now you have black populations in, throughout, in fact, the Americas. Now, should they be grateful to Christopher Columbus for making possible the Americas and making possible Western civilization here, which of course shamefully included slavery as one of its key components in its early centuries? Well, there's a great deal of argument, actually, among certainly United States African Americans over this very question. Ward Connolly, for example, one of the great black conservatives from the state of California, has argued that he, in fact, is grateful that as awful as the slavery of his ancestors may have been, that they were brought to the New World because he, as an American, as a citizen of the United States, has been able to flourish, and his family has been able to flourish to a much greater extent than any ancestors or any distant relatives they may have in Africa itself. So if you compare the prosperity of black Americans, whether in the United States or indeed in other parts of the Americas, certainly in Canada, but even in South America, you will find that generally persons of African descent flourish much better in the New World, in the Americas, than they do in the Old World, in Africa itself. So there is a case to be made that, in fact, even people who have African ancestry and whose ancestors were brought over here in chains, nevertheless, today in the 21st century, have reason to be grateful to Christopher Columbus for making possible the life that they have now as members of the Western Hemisphere's outpost of European civilization. So it's a success even for many of the people who at first were the victims of slavery and the victims of the worst elements of our civilization. Christopher Columbus can be hailed as a hero even by those people. Now, there is, of course, a category which perhaps does not want to hail Christopher Columbus as a hero because they were already here, and this is the indigenous population of the Americas, which, of course, was divided into a great many tribes, a great many what we would call perhaps nations. They were not organized as political nation-states, of course, but they were organized as empires, as tribes, as any number of other kinds of confederations and other combinations of smaller units. Indigenous Americans have the strongest case against Christopher Columbus, quite obviously, not only because Columbus's own relations with Indians, as he called them, were mixed. They were, sometimes quite unfavorable. There were a number of Indians who were taken captives on Columbus's ships and taken over to the New World. Columbus himself, as a governor, again, there are competing or contesting accounts of Columbus's work as a governor in the New World. And there are some who say that he was a cruel governor, that he was terrible to his Indian subjects. So there are certainly cases to be made by indigenous Americans, by the survivors today of the original or the older population of the New World, who have good reason not to honor Christopher Columbus and who, in fact, see him as still someone who, in memory, is an opponent of their people and of the very way of life that they had been enjoying. Now, of course, the way of life that the Indians had been enjoying before the arrival of Christopher Columbus was hardly a thing that anyone would point to as an example of the best possible human life. Quite the contrary. There, in fact, were horrific, religious practices, including human sacrifice among the Aztecs in Central America. You had cannibals, basically, and in fact, cannibals quite literally in the Caribbean. There were all sorts of very, sort of bad political and social environments, religious environments in the New World long before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. This is true even in North America, where Indian groups would often fight wars that were very, very bloody indeed between one another or among themselves. And this included, war crimes against women. It included any number of what we now recognize as human rights abuses. So it was hardly the case that the New World or the Americas were a Eden-like paradise before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Quite the contrary. You had war, you had slavery, and you even had cannibalism and human sacrifice, evils that had been more or less, eliminated in Europe for a very long time. Even these things have been going on in the New World before the arrival of Columbus and were wiped out, basically, by the arrival of Western civilization. So on those grounds, even here we have something of a mixed verdict. And even indigenous Americans, even American Indians, might feel gratitude towards Christopher Columbus for a variety of reasons, even for the degree of prosperity that is shared by American Indians today in the United States. But of course, it is a mixed history, and it's very much a morally uncertain verdict for indigenous Americans, because they lost so much, even if there are things that they gained as well. So individual groups have their reasons for being either pro-Columbus or anti-Columbus. And it seems to me overwhelmingly most groups have good reason to be grateful to Christopher Columbus and to honor him with Columbus Day. And therefore, it's mostly an ideological excess on the part of everyone except indigenous Americans and perhaps arguably some African Americans. But otherwise, it's purely an ideological choice to be anti-Columbus and to oppose Columbus Day and to say that Columbus Day is a bad thing. It comes out of a ideological dislike of Christianity. It comes out of an ideological dislike of Western civilization. It is driven by a left-wing view that Western civilization should not have expanded in the first place and that should probably contract right now, or that should be completely bypassed and thrown aside. Now, I should say perhaps there are also liberals and progressives who criticize Christopher Columbus and who think there should not be a holiday named after him because they do believe these accusations that his enemies made, that he was a cruel governor, or that they, would simply say that, look, Christopher Columbus, whatever his virtues, whatever his vices, was clearly not a paragon of Enlightenment virtue. He was not a modern, tolerant, sort of liberal Democrat, small l, small d. Christopher Columbus was, a man of the early modern era. He was a man of the Renaissance, and therefore, on a whole number of levels, he would today be recognized as politically correct, unenlightened, and therefore unworthy of having a national American holiday in his honor. So you have these perhaps two different versions of the left-wing argument against Christopher Columbus, one of which says he was not a man of the Enlightenment and therefore he should not be honored, and one of which says, you know what, he was a man of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is bad, just like Christianity is bad, because all these things are parts of Western civilization, and Western civilization is all about colonialism, all about destroying indigenous populations. It is a purely evil thing, and it should be opposed always and everywhere. So you have these two left-wing criticisms, one of which is more radical than the other, but both, in fact, are quite radical, and both of which are quite disturbing and disruptive for the American civic polity, for our republic. I should mention, by the way, that Christopher Columbus. I think ordinary children, of all backgrounds, can recognize Columbus as a heroic figure in the same way they recognize astronauts as heroic figures, that in fact, Christopher Columbus, he risked his life to expand the frontiers of knowledge and to embark on this great adventure of discovery. And I really highly recommend accounts, including some of Columbus's own, but written accounts of the age of exploration, not just the discovery of the Americas, but also the circumnavigation of Africa, the arrival of Europeans in India. All of these tales of the age of discovery and exploration are tremendously inspiring simply as human tales. That it's wonderful to read these accounts of these people, these men who risked their lives on the open seas and who had no idea if they would ever be able to return home, simply because they wanted to expand the frontiers of their civilization and of human knowledge. And in the same way that astronauts risk their lives by going to the moon and going into space, so too these men who went onto the unexplored ocean were risking their lives, and of course a great many of them never came back. So there is this simple sort of human inspiration that one finds in Columbus as well. I think that there is, an overwhelmingly powerful case because so many people owe so much gratitude to Christopher Columbus for having Columbus Day as one of our American public holidays. But we could say, well, wait a minute, maybe this shouldn't simply be about whether a majority of groups have good reason to honor Columbus and only a minority have reason to oppose him. Maybe we're going to say we have to have a universal reason, something that includes absolutely everyone in gratitude or shame with respect to Christopher Columbus, if we're going to have a universal federal holiday for him at all. Well, on universal grounds, I think there are, in fact, three reasons why we should all be prepared to honor Christopher Columbus. And these are three competing universal grounds. So really, any individual can only have one of them, maybe at most two, but probably not all three of these grounds for finding Christopher Columbus to be worthy of honor. Nevertheless, most people will agree with one of these three arguments, if not two of them. So the first, of course, is simply an argument from universalism, an argument especially from the universality of the Christian religion. If you are a Christian, if you believe in Christianity, then Christopher Columbus is a figure of absolutely providential importance in world history. Because again, he is someone who opens the new world, a pagan world, to the truth of Christianity and to the light of the gospel. And so Christopher Columbus, whatever his human flaws, was someone who was basically an agent of God in bringing the faith to people who had never heard the gospel before, and in allowing for the proliferation of Christianity, not just among the indigenous population, but also in the rising new populations that have taken root in the New World in the Americas. So Christopher Columbus, on universal Christian grounds, is someone who should certainly be honored and seen as a providential figure. Now, beyond that, you can also make a very similar case on grounds of the universality of Western civilization, basically on Platonic grounds. And in this view, Christopher Columbus was extremely important, not just because he brought a particular religion, which some people might not accept, but because he brought a civilization, a philosophy, which claims to be universal. And on these grounds, the fact that the people who are able to read Plato, people who are inclined to read, Plato and Aristotle, and these great philosophers who had a message not just for their fellow Greeks, but in fact for the entire world, this is another kind of learning, another kind of human universal belief that has been made accessible to the New World, including accessible simply through literacy itself. All of this has been made possible thanks to the evangelism, thanks to the explorations undertaken by Christopher Columbus. Again, it's not a matter of whether Columbus himself was coming to the New World in order to spread the truth of Greek philosophy, but of course that was one of the inevitable consequences of bringing the New World into the European sphere of culture and civilization. So on those, sort of more philosophical grounds, as well as on strictly Christian grounds, in both cases, there is a universal argument to be made that Columbus played an absolutely vital role in widening the scope of the most important things in civilization itself. Now, I said that there were three rationales that one could point to that are universal, that would lead one to respect Christopher Columbus. So I mean the Christian example, and in fact one could say monotheism more generally, because I think certainly monotheism, including Judaism, has come to the New World thanks to the efforts ultimately of Christopher Columbus. Similarly true even for Islam. It was not Muslim explorers who discovered the New World, it was Christopher Columbus. And the fact that we have Muslims in the New World today, that too is a legacy of Columbus, and something for which even Muslims who may not agree with Columbus's religion, even they should also honor Columbus for what he's made possible for their religion. Well, the philosophical case, in terms of classical philosophy, is closely aligned, perhaps, closely parallel to the Christian case. Less parallel, perhaps, is the case of Enlightenment philosophy. And as I said, there are liberals, there are progressives who say that Columbus is not a model of Enlightenment philosophy. He's not a model of Enlightenment statesmanship. He's not a model of, the Kantian virtues, and therefore Columbus should not be honored. But in fact, he should be, because it's only thanks to Columbus that we can talk about Kantian ideals being present in the New World at all. Without Columbus making possible the spread of European civilization to the New World, you would not have the spread even of the Enlightenment philosophers who now want to criticize the memory of Christopher Columbus. So even those in the West today, in the, I should say, the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, even those who think of themselves as heirs to the Enlightenment, heirs to Voltaire and Rousseau and others, and who condemn Christopher Columbus as being insufficiently enlightened, perhaps for being, too Christian, or simply not, being elevated enough in terms of modern philosophy and modern sensibilities, even these people must celebrate Christopher Columbus because he's the one who made possible the communication of this Enlightenment philosophy and the flourishing of this Enlightenment philosophy in the New World, in the Americas. So there is a very good case to be made, in the language of Voltaire or Rousseau or indeed Kant, in defense of Christopher Columbus and indeed honoring Christopher Columbus for the work that he's done to spread even the Enlightenment version of reason more thoroughly across the globe, and in fact has helped it to be particularly intense in the New World. So there's an Enlightenment case to be made universally for the work of Christopher Columbus as well. Finally, there is a third, and as I say, rather incompatible with the other two, case to be made for honoring Christopher Columbus. Now, this is the case that I would make even to the most embittered anti-Western ideologues on the left, people who say, you know what, not only are we horrified that Christianity and that classical philosophy have come to the New World, not only do we think those are bad things, we also think the Enlightenment is a bad thing. We think that this legacy of the Enlightenment is in fact another legacy of oppression and colonialism and slavery and so forth, and therefore we reject Western civilization as a whole, and so what could we possibly see as being good about Christopher Columbus discovering the New World and bringing Western civilization to the Americas? Well, this third and final criterion, this third and final way of looking at Christopher Columbus as a subject worthy of honor, or at least worthy of deep respect, is simply based on the survival of the fittest. And it's a much more Machiavellian case to be made for Christopher Columbus. But frankly, if you're going to reject universal horizons, if you're going to reject the universal ideals of Christianity or of monotheism more generally, if you're going to reject the universalism of Socrates and of the Greek philosophical tradition, if you're going to reject the universalism of Kant and the Enlightenment, then what are you left with? If you reject all of those things, then you are left with a world that is simply a contest of power. And if the world is simply a contest of power, then you should at least have a great deal of respect for Christopher Columbus as a very powerful figure, a figure who is able to, cross the oceans, a man who accomplished great things himself and with his crew, who came to the New World and there was able to bring a much more advanced technology, not just actual technology like firearms, but conceptual technology as well, political technology, forms of human organization. These came from Christopher Columbus and revolutionized the New World. And of course, a great many indigenous peoples adopted the technologies that came from the New World. So for example, in North America, riding horses becomes a very important part of the culture of American Indians. But horses, and the riding of horses especially, is something that is brought over by Europeans. There's some argument. It does seem as if horses evolutionarily originated in the New World, but went extinct in the New World, became a feature of Arabia and a feature of Europe long before they then returned to the New World and became adopted by American Indians as part of their culture of horse riding. That's all a little bit murky. There are new studies even today which are showing that a lot of horses that Indians have had access to for a very long time, we've known for centuries that these horses are genetically derived from the horses brought over by the Spanish. But there were some horses, wild horses, where there was a question mark about whether or not they were derived from horses that had gotten off of a Spanish shipwreck and had nativized themselves in the Americas, and recent genetic studies suggest that this is indeed the case. But in any case, whether or not that's completely correct, it certainly is true overall that Christopher Columbus brought a new sense of technology, new kinds of technology, new cultural developments, and indeed more powerful technologies and more powerful cultural currents to the New World. And so even if you reject Western civilization, and even if you reject the Enlightenment and Christianity and everything else connected with Christopher Columbus, you have to respect the technology and the power that he brought over. Because indeed, if you want to create any kind of non-Western civilization, any kind of polity, any kind of organization that's going to of human beings that is going to reject the very things that you find objectionable about Christopher Columbus and his legacy, you're going to have to use the very technology that ultimately was introduced by Columbus in order to create your own kind of alternative civilization. Power is a universal language, and it's a language whose grammar Christopher Columbus helped to teach the New World in a much more profound way. So that's a very dark and very cynical view of what Christopher Columbus brought to the New World, and yet it's a view that if you are going to reject the values and the morality of Christianity and monotheism on the one hand, or of classical civilization, or of the Enlightenment philosophy, if you're going to reject all of those universal moral views, then what are you left with? You're left with a world simply of technology and power. And there too, Christopher Columbus was someone who brought innovation to a part of the world which had never had it before. That innovation necessarily succeeded against what was more primitive. And now, of course, if the remnants of the pre-Columbian civilization or pre-Columbian point of view, or indeed if Americans who are of European descent or any other descent who want to reject their own civilization, want to reject the universalism that is associated with classical philosophy and the Enlightenment and Christianity, even if you are the most hardline anti-colonialist leftist, you necessarily have to embrace modern technology. And of course, if you want to succeed, that is. And if you don't want to succeed, then you're just going to wind up like the populations that wound up being displaced by the arrival of Christopher Columbus and his Spaniards. So if you don't want to wind up like that, then you have no choice but to adopt technology. And if you are going to adopt technology, then you have to be respectful, at least, if not necessarily morally grateful, but certainly respectful of the man who brought higher technology to the New World in the first place, namely Christopher Columbus. On all these grounds, Columbus Day is something that if we're going to have, again, federal holidays that are honoring particular individuals or, a variety of causes, Christopher Columbus has a better claim than any other individual except for George Washington to having a federal holiday in the United States named after him. And really, not only should Christians and, Americans of European descent recognize this, but indeed everyone whose ancestors came to America voluntarily should recognize this. And even, as I say, African Americans whose ancestors came to America involuntarily, they too might be very grateful for the civilization in which they now live, which is better than what the level of civilization is in Africa right now. And then even those indigenous Americans, even those on the hard left who strongly oppose Western civilization, who strongly oppose the universal values that Christopher Columbus and those who followed him ultimately brought to the New World in the form of Christianity, classical philosophy, and the Enlightenment, even the most hardline left-wing opponents of these things, they must respect the technology and the power that civilization brought to the Americas, Western civilization brought to the Americas, and that Christopher Columbus ultimately made possible. On all of these grounds, having a day to honor Christopher Columbus as the founder of something tremendously great in the Americas as a whole and in the United States in particular is entirely appropriate. Columbus Day is one of the most worthy holidays that we have, along with the 4th of July.